It started not with a bang, but with the gentle, almost reverent scent of burning paper. A scent I'd always associated with cozy winter nights and Dad's ridiculously oversized armchair. Tonight, however, it was the smell of my future turning to ash. I walked into the living room, drawn by the unusual quiet. Mom was standing before the fireplace, which was roaring despite the mild April evening. She held the heavy silver poker, its end glowing a faint orange, her silhouette sharp and unyielding against the dancing flames. She looked like a pagan priestess performing some ancient, terrifying ritual. "Oh, good, you're here," she said, her voice as smooth and cool as polished marble. "I was just tidying up." My eyes shot to the mantelpiece, and there it was. Or what was left of it. A single scorched corner of thick, creamy cardstock. The proud, Gothic B of the Blackwood University crest still faintly visible. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. I'd stared at that acceptance letter for 3 straight days, memorized the weight of the paper, the elegant swoop of the dean's signature. It was real. It was my ticket out, and now it was tidied up. "What did you do?" My voice came out as a whisper, a tiny, fragile thing in the face of the roaring fire. "I made an executive decision about your future, darling." She turned to me then, and the placid, serene smile on her face was the most violent thing I had ever seen. "Blackwood simply isn't the right environment for you. All those liberal arts professors with their ideas. It's a breeding ground for disappointment. I couldn't allow it." I stared at her, at the perfectly coiffed blonde hair, the tasteful cashmere sweater, the complete and utter lack of remorse in her ice blue eyes. My own mother, the woman who had drilled me on SAT words, who had edited every single one of my application essays, who had smiled and hugged me when I'd shown her the letter. "You burned it," I said, the words finally finding their footing, heavy and ugly in my mouth. "You burned my acceptance letter." "Don't be so dramatic, Alara. It's just paper." She gestured vaguely towards the fire. "Besides, I've already taken care of everything. I paid your enrollment deposit this morning for Northgate Community College. It's a much more appropriate choice. Closer to home. Safer." Safer. The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My world, a vibrant, sprawling map of possibilities just moments ago, had shrunk to the size of this room, to the stifling confines of her control. The roaring in the fireplace was nothing compared to the roaring in my ears. A scream was building in my chest, a primal wounded thing, but I choked it down. A scene would give her satisfaction. It would prove her right that I was just a hysterical child who needed her guidance. I gave her something else instead. Silence. I turned without another word and walked to my room. The placid smile on her face burned into the back of my eyelids. I shut the door, and the silence I had gifted her in the living room became my own private torture chamber. Every dream I had meticulously constructed for myself, every late-night study session, every sacrifice, had been incinerated on a whim. She hadn't just burned a letter. She had burned me. She had burned the me I was supposed to become. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Mom acted as if she'd saved me from a sinking ship, breezily discussing dorm essentials for Northgate and pointing out its charming local campus in brochures. She filled the house with bright, cheerful chatter that felt like shards of glass in the suffocating silence I wrapped around myself like a shroud. I was a ghost in my own home, a sullen teenager in her eyes, but inside a cold, hard knot of rage was beginning to form, dense and heavy as a dying star. It was during this period of enforced mourning that she decided my room needed a purging. "A fresh start, sweetie," she'd chirped, handing me a stack of empty boxes. It was her way of erasing any last vestige of the girl who had dared to dream of Blackwood. I was numbly sorting through my closet, a graveyard of old debate team t-shirts and prom dresses I never wore, when my hand brushed against the heavy wool of my grandmother's old winter coat. Mom had insisted I keep it after Grandma passed, a strange request given how little she ever spoke of her own mother. I was about to shove it in a donation box when my fingers found a hard, unfamiliar lump in the lining. My heart gave a strange little flutter, I tore at the seam with my fingernails, the thread old and brittle. Inside, tucked away in the padding, was an old skeleton key, heavy and ornate, the kind you see in Gothic movies. Beneath it was a crisp, folded business card: Silas Croft, ESQ, Estates and Acquisitions. And on the back, in my grandmother's spidery, elegant handwriting, were words that felt like a secret whispered across time. For when you are ready to choose your own future. The law office of Silas Croft was everything my mother's world was not. It was old, smelled of leather and dust, and was unapologetically crammed with books. Not the decorative, color-coordinated spines on Mom's shelves, but real lived-in books, stacked on floors and spilling from chairs. Silas Croft himself looked like he'd been hatched from one of them. He was a tall, stooped man in his late 70s, with a magnificent cloud of white hair and eyebrows that seemed to have a life of their own. He peered at me over a pair of precariously perched spectacles as I presented the key and the card. "Ah," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "Eleonora's girl, I was wondering when you'd turn up. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. Far more than your mother ever gave her credit for." He took the key and walked over to a massive dark wood cabinet that took up an entire wall. He unlocked it, the click echoing loudly in the quiet room. Inside weren't files, but a series of worn leather-bound ledgers. He pulled one out. "Your grandmother, Elara," he began, settling back into his chair and fixing me with a look that was both kind and piercingly shrewd, "was a woman of considerable means and considerable secrets. She knew her daughter, your mother, was, let's call it, fiscally controlling. That was one way to put it. Psychotically manipulative tyrant was another. She established a trust fund for you the day you were born," Mr. Croft continued, tapping a long, bony finger on the open ledger. "A blind trust, hidden from everyone. She stipulated that you were not to be told about it until your 18th birthday, or until you presented that key. Whichever came later. It seems you've come a bit late, but no matter." He turned the ledger around for me to see. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, my brain struggling to make sense of the zeros. It wasn't a college fund, it wasn't a nest egg, it was a fortune. The kind of money that didn't just buy things, but bought power. I don't understand," I stammered. "My mom always said Grandma was poor." "Your mother believes what is convenient for her to believe," Mr. Croft said dryly. "Eleonora was a brilliant investor. She inherited a small sum and grew it into this. She lived modestly because she had no interest in the world your mother worships. Her only interest was you." I sank back into the plush leather chair, my head spinning. The rage that had been a hard, cold knot in my chest began to liquefy, morphing into something else, something hot and sharp and dangerously exhilarating. "There is one peculiar stipulation," Mr. Croft added, peering at me over his glasses again. "Eleonora was a great believer in knowledge. The trust dictates that a significant portion of the annual disbursements must be used for the acquisition and preservation of knowledge." He raised a bushy eyebrow. "A rather poetic and wonderfully vague directive. One could, for instance, fund a scholarship, or endow a university department, or buy a library." The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was insane. It was audacious. It was perfect. A response so far outside my mother's realm of understanding that she would never see it coming. I wouldn't just defy her choice of a safe college. I would take ownership of the very heart of the institution she feared, the place she'd tried to steal from me. I would carve my victory into its stone walls. I looked at Mr. Croft, a slow smile spreading across my face. It probably looked a little unhinged. "Mr. Croft," I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks, "how does one go about acquiring a university library?" He blinked. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, a slow, deep chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Eleonora's girl, indeed," he murmured, a glint of something that looked suspiciously like delight in his old eyes. "Well, one doesn't simply walk in with a checkbook. It requires finesse, strategy, a great deal of money funneled through the right channels. It would be a siege, Miss Vance. A quiet, patient, financial siege." I'm a very patient person, I said, thinking of all the years I'd patiently endured my mother's control. And I'd like to set up a foundation, a shell corporation. Let's call it the Phoenix Foundation. Because I was going to rise from the ashes she'd made of my future. And I was going to burn her world to the ground. Life became a bizarre split-screen movie. On one side, there was miserable Ilara trudging through the aggressively beige hallways of Northgate Community College. I sat through remedial classes I could have taught, smiled wanly at my mother's cheerful dinner table interrogations. Did you make any nice friends today, sweetie? And played the part of the dutiful, broken-in daughter. On the other side, there was Nightingale. That was the pseudonym I adopted for my communications. It felt suitably mysterious. Nightingale, the faceless head of the Phoenix Foundation, spent her evenings in a sleek, minimalist apartment I'd leased in the city under the foundation's name, My War Room. With Mr. Croft's guidance, I'd hired a team of shockingly young, terrifyingly competent financial advisors who knew me only as Nightingale and communicated through encrypted channels. "All right, Nightingale," a voice belonging to a 28-year-old Wharton grad named Ben would crackle over the speakerphone. "Phase 1 is a go. We've made the initial donation to the Blackwood University Library's Rare Manuscript Restoration Fund. It's large enough to get their attention, but not so large it screams hostile takeover." "Good," I'd reply, my voice pitched a little lower, a little cooler. The voice of a woman who owned rooms, not a girl who was forced to clean hers. The donation worked like a charm. An effusively grateful email arrived from the library's acquisitions department. They'd assigned a point person to coordinate with the Phoenix Foundation. A part-time employee, a law student named Julian Thorne. His first email was formal, professional. I replied as Nightingale, equally formal. But as we exchanged messages about the logistics of the restoration project, which was just a pretense for me to get a foothold, a different tone began to emerge. He'd make a dry joke about the university's bureaucracy. I'd parry with a sarcastic comment about the joys of anonymous benefactors. "Julian, just spent an hour in a meeting about the appropriate pH level for the archival paper. I'm starting to think these 17th century manuscripts have a better healthcare plan than I do." Nightingale, "You should see the writer in my contract about the emotional support peacock. He requires a diet of organic figs and constant validation." Julian, "Ha, a peacock. I should have known. You sound formidable." Nightingale, "I'm just a girl standing in front of a library, asking it to love her. He was witty, smart, and he loved the library with the same nerdy passion I did. It was intoxicating and terrifying. I was weaving a web, and he was walking right into it, an unwitting but charming fly." To further my reconnaissance, I started visiting the Blackwood Library in person. It was a cathedral of knowledge, all soaring arches, dark wood, and the hushed, sacred silence of turning pages. I'd find a carol in a remote corner and just breathe. This was the prize. This was the kingdom. On my third visit, I saw him, Julian Thorne. He was exactly as I'd pictured him from his witty emails, tall, a little lanky, with a mess of dark hair that fell into his eyes when he was concentrating on a book. He was arguing with another student, his hands gesturing emphatically. "It's not just a building, man," he was saying, his voice a low, passionate rumble. "It's a repository of the entire human argument. You can't just talk about selling off its naming rights like it's a football stadium." My ears perked up. Selling the naming rights? I made my move. I accidentally dropped a stack of books right near him. It was a classic, cheesy move, and I felt like an idiot, but it worked. "Oh, let me help you with that," he said, rushing over. He looked up, and his blue eyes were even more startling in person. "Hey, you're Ilara, right? From Northgate? I think you were in my cousin's graduating class." My blood ran cold. Of course, the world was that small. My carefully constructed double life felt suddenly fragile. Yeah," I managed, my voice a squeak. Not exactly the formidable Nightingale. "Small world. Tell me about it." He smiled, a lopsided, easy grin. "What brings a Northgate student all the way over here, slumming it with the elites?" "I like your library better," I said, finding my footing. "It's quiet." "Not for long if our board gets their way," he muttered, his good mood souring. The chairman, Alistair Finch, is trying to push through a deal with some tech bro. Wants to rename this place the Zucker Something Innovation Hub. It's sacrilege. Alistair Finch. The name echoed in my head from Mr. Croft's initial research. The powerful chairman of the Board of Trustees, my unseen enemy. That's awful, I said, and the sincerity in my voice was real. Yeah, he sighed. Anyway, sorry. You don't want to hear about university politics. No, I do, I said, a little too quickly. Tell me about it. Tell me everything. And he did. Julian became my inside man, completely unaware he was playing the part. We started meeting for coffee. He'd complain about Finch's strong-arm tactics and the board's obsession with money over mission. I'd listen, offering a sympathetic ear while secretly taking mental notes, forwarding every detail to my team. I felt a pang of guilt. He was funny and kind, and he was starting to look at me in a way that had nothing to do with libraries. But every time I saw his face, I pictured my mother's serene smile in the firelight, and the guilt turned back into fuel. The deeper I dug into Blackwood, the more I felt a strange sense of familiarity, a ghost of a connection I couldn't place. On a whim, I had my team pull the university's student archives from the 80s. I typed in a name I hadn't thought about in years, Serafina Dubois, my mother's maiden name. I expected nothing. A summer course, maybe. What I found knocked the air out of my lungs. Serafina Dubois, scholarship student, star of the history department. Dean's list, every semester. There were photos of her, young and vibrant, her eyes bright with an ambition I had never seen in them. She looked happy and free. Then, in the spring of 1988, her final year, it just stopped. Her name vanished from the records. No graduation notice, no alumni listing, just an abrupt clean break. A digital ghost. Mr. Croft, I said into my encrypted phone later that night, my voice trembling slightly. I need you to find something for me. A sealed disciplinary record from Blackwood University, 1988. The student's name was Serafina Dubois. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Elara, he said, his voice unusually gentle. Are you sure you want to open that door? I'm already in the hallway, I replied. I need to know what's in the room. While Mr. Croft's legal beagles were digging into my mother's past, I escalated the siege. The Phoenix Foundation made a new offer to Blackwood, a massive one. We would fund a state-of-the-art science wing, a new performing arts center, and a full scholarship program for underprivileged students. It was an offer so generous it was almost obscene. The Board of Trustees practically salivated. The offer was accepted in a record-breaking emergency session, but there was a catch buried deep in the 100-page contract my team had drafted. The Phoenix Foundation required a permanent seat on the board's subcommittee for infrastructure and endowment. My seat. An anonymous, proxy seat, but a seat nonetheless. I was in. My first act on the committee, via my proxy, was to pour cold water on Chairman Finch's plan to sell the library's naming rights. I argued that it would devalue the university's brand, that the library was a sacred trust, not a corporate billboard. I used the same passionate language Julian had used with me. The move infuriated Finch. Julian told me all about it over coffee, his eyes shining with admiration for the mysterious Nightingale. You should have heard it, Elara. This Nightingale person, whoever they are, completely dismantled Finch's proposal, used his own arguments about brand integrity against him. It was beautiful. He was furious. Sounds like a formidable woman, I said, sipping my latte, my heart doing a complicated tango of pride and deceit. She is. He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. You know, it's funny. Sometimes when she writes, she sounds a little bit like you. I almost choked. Me? I'm just a community college student who likes old books. Yeah, I know. He smiled, that easy, lopsided grin that made my stomach flip. But you've got that same quiet fire. I like it. The guilt was becoming a physical weight. Here was this wonderful, decent guy, and I was using him as an unwitting pawn in a revenge plot against my own mother. It was getting complicated. My neat, clean lines of righteous anger were getting smudged with real, messy human feelings. The smudging got worse when Mr. Croft called. We have the record, he said, his voice grim. It wasn't easy. It was buried deep. Alistair Finch has a lot of loyal friends. And? I asked, my hand clenched around the phone. It's ugly, Alara. Your mother was accused of having an affair with a senior professor. A married man with children. A rising star in the faculty. Finch, I breathed. No, a man named Professor Albright. He was Finch's mentor and his chief rival for tenure. According to the record, your mother was caught in his office in a compromising position. Albright claimed she seduced him, that she was trying to trade favors for grades. She was expelled. He was given a slap on the wrist and quietly granted tenure a few months later. Finch got his promotion shortly after. It was all very neat. She never told me, I whispered. The image of my mother, so brittle and controlling, suddenly fractured, revealing a younger, humiliated girl beneath. The accusation ruined her, Alara, Mr. Croft said softly. It followed her. The academic world is small. Her dreams of being a historian, a professor, they were gone. She came home, met your father a year later, and built a new life. A perfect, controlled life where nothing could ever touch her again. And where her daughter would never be allowed the freedom to make the same mistakes. My mother's tyranny wasn't about protecting me from the world. It was about protecting herself from her own past. It wasn't an act of malice. It was an act of profound, twisted, desperate fear. My clean, righteous anger was gone. In its place was a churning sea of pity, confusion, and an even deeper, more profound rage. Not just at my mother now, but at the institution, at the man that had broken her and turned her into the woman who would burn her own daughter's future. Alistair Finch, the chairman of the board. He hadn't just tried to sell off a library. He had built his career on the ruins of my mother's. Alara? Mr. Croft's voice broke through my thoughts. I'm here, I said, my voice cold and clear as ice. The strategy has changed. This is no longer a philanthropic acquisition. This is a hostile takeover. I'm not just buying the library anymore. I'm going to burn Alistair Finch to the ground. The final phase was swift and brutal. My team, fueled by my newfound cold fury, moved with the precision of sharks that smell blood. We stopped making donations. Instead, we started buying Blackwood's debt. It turned out the university, under Finch's free-spending leadership, was leveraged to the hilt. We bought bonds from creditors, quietly, efficiently, until the Phoenix Foundation was the university's primary financial stakeholder. We were no longer a benevolent benefactor. We were the bank. Then we uncovered Finch's dirty little secret. He'd been using university funds to finance a lavish lifestyle, cleverly hidden through a web of discretionary accounts and consulting fees. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. It was the kind of scandal that didn't just get a chairman fired, it got him jail time and shattered a university's reputation for a generation. I had him. Mr. Croft arranged the meeting, an emergency session of the Board of Trustees. He advised me to send him as my proxy, but I refused. Nightingale was done hiding. I walked into the Blackwood boardroom wearing a simple dark gray dress. It was the kind of dress my mother would have called sensible. The room was paneled in dark wood, dominated by a long, imposing table. Around it sat a dozen men and one woman, all in their 60s and 70s, all looking at me like I was a catering assistant who'd wandered into the wrong room. Alistair Finch sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of smug irritation. "Can we help you, miss?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is a private meeting." "I know," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying in the suddenly silent room. "I'm the one who called it." I placed my briefcase on the table and opened it. "I am the principal of the Phoenix Foundation." The wave of shock that rolled through the room was a palpable thing. Jaws literally dropped. Finch's smug mask dissolved into disbelief, then panic as I laid out my terms. I slid a single file folder across the polished wood towards him. "That," I said, "is a detailed accounting of your creative use of the university's endowment fund. I believe the district attorney would find it fascinating reading." He went pale. "And this," I continued, my voice hardening, "is for the rest of you." I distributed copies of another file. "This is proof that Blackwood University is currently insolvent, and that my foundation holds a controlling interest in its debt. I can force a bankruptcy proceeding this afternoon. Your gilded reputations would be tarnished permanently. I let that sink in. I could hear the sound of my own heart beating, a steady, powerful rhythm. I don't want to do that, I said, my voice softening slightly. I love this university, or at least I love what it's supposed to stand for. So, here is my offer. My foundation will forgive all of the university's debt. We will inject enough capital to ensure its solvency for the next 50 years. The evidence of Mr. Finch's indiscretions will be permanently buried. A wave of relief washed over their faces. They were off the hook, but they hadn't heard the price. In exchange, I said, looking directly at Finch, my face devoid of all emotion, I want one thing. You will sign over the deed to the university library. Not the naming rights, the entire building, its contents, its endowment. It will become the sole private property of my foundation in perpetuity. Mr. Finch will announce his immediate retirement for health reasons, and I will be given the privilege of renaming the building as I see fit. It was an impossible demand, an unprecedented violation of academic tradition, but I had them. Finch, fighting for his freedom, and the board, fighting for their legacy. It was checkmate. The rededication ceremony for the library was a grand affair. The university, eager to spin the narrative, had billed it as a celebration of a new era of philanthropy. I had insisted my mother be invited. She sat in the front row, radiating smug triumph. She had seen the news of Finch's sudden retirement and the library's mysterious savior. In her mind, she had won. Her daughter was safely tucked away at community college, and the evil institution that represented freedom had been brought to heel by some other force. Julian was in the crowd, too. He'd sent me a dozen confused, hurt emails after the board meeting. I hadn't responded. I owed him an explanation, but not an apology. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and betrayal that twisted my stomach. Finch, looking old and defeated, gave a short, mumbled speech about transitions and new beginnings. Then, his voice cracking, he was forced to introduce me. It is my distinct honor to introduce the principal of the Phoenix Foundation, the new patron of this historic institution, Miss Ilara Vance. My mother's face. I will never forget the look on my mother's face. It was a perfect, crystalline moment of shattering. Her carefully constructed world, her entire sense of reality, crumbled in that single instant. The blood drained from her face, her mouth opening in a silent O of pure shock. I walked to the podium, the silence in the grand hall absolute. I looked out over the sea of faces, the bewildered trustees, the confused faculty, Julian's wounded eyes, and my mother's broken stare. There are many kinds of silence, I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. There is the comfortable silence between old friends. There is the shocked silence of a crowd. And then there is the silence that is imposed. The silence of a story that is never told. The silence of a voice that is not allowed to speak. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Decades ago, a brilliant young student had her voice silenced within these walls. Her future was stolen, her name erased. More recently, another young woman had her future almost burned in a fireplace, her dreams dismissed by someone who thought they knew best. I looked directly at my mother. For the first time, I saw not a tyrant, but a frightened woman, a victim of the same system I was now dismantling. This building will no longer be a monument to egos or a billboard for corporate vanity, I declared. It will be a sanctuary, a place for the quiet pursuit of truth, a place for the stories that have been silenced. In honor of every voice that has ever been hushed, this library has a new name. I gestured to the two attendants standing by the large velvet curtain covering the library's main entrance. They pulled the cord. The curtain fell away, revealing not a new name carved in stone, but the old one, beautifully restored. And below it, in elegant, understated silver letters, a single, powerful word. Silence. The gasp from the crowd was a collective rush of wind. It was an insult, a provocation, a poem. My work was done. Weeks later, the noise had faded. The media storm had moved on. Finch was gone. My mother and I were no longer speaking. A new kind of silence between us, this one colder and more honest than any before. I walked through the doors of my library. My library. A massive, elegantly carved sign above the entrance confirmed its new permanent identity. Inside, the silence was different. It wasn't empty, it was full. It was the rich, promising silence of millions of pages waiting to be read, of ideas waiting to be discovered. I ran my hand along a row of leather-bound books, the smell of old paper and history filling my senses. I had taken my mother's most destructive act and forged it into my greatest strength. I had taken her weapon, her suffocating silence, and turned it into a kingdom. I found a quiet nook in a sun-drenched corner, a spot I knew Julian had always loved. I pulled a book from the shelf, a first edition of Virginia Woolf. I sat down, the worn leather of the armchair creaking softly. I opened the book. The only sound in the vast, echoing hall was the gentle, hopeful rustle of a turning page. It was the sound of my victory. It was the sound of my voice, finally, truly, my own.